Hello, and welcome to the second lesson of the course. In this lecture, we continue our discussion of medieval British literature that we began last time with Beowulf. As I mentioned last time, Beowulf was considered one of the first pieces of medieval literature, and our class begins during the medieval period. And for the most part, we'll be going chronologically, with a few slight deviations here and there because thematically they make more sense in terms of connecting the dots between ideas. And this lesson's content is one of those slight deviations. I like to also keep the class focused on the same culture or location before moving on to a different area, a different region. So that's one reason why sometimes there are slight deviations from the chronology. But for the most part, there's slight deviations. We don't jump forward to another time period or anything. So we're starting the class with medieval British literature and concluding the class with Renaissance British literature because British literature of the different cultures was just so influential in these two movements we study in the course, the medieval period and the Renaissance. And as I said, the medieval period really began, or the beginning of it, is marked by Beowulf. And Shakespeare, who we'll study at the end of the course, represents the height of the Renaissance. So it makes sense to bookend the course that way. But the two authors we're looking at in this lesson, Marie de France and Geoffrey Chaucer, were a little bit later than Beowulf. Some of the things we'll study over the next 3 lessons as we round out the medieval period were actually written before the Lays of Marie de France, and especially before Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which are considered one of the last pieces of medieval literature. He's even kind of knocking on the door of the Renaissance with some Renaissance-type themes, Chaucer is. But these authors do profess a uniquely British perspective that relates to Beowulf. And so rather than jumping back and forth, I think it just makes sense to push through with the British literature before we look at Islam and France and Spain and Italy and some of these other Western European countries. So we'll start with Marie de France, who precedes Chaucer, and after the Beowulf poet and Chaucer is one of the most influential British writers of the medieval period. And her texts are probably much more similar to Beowulf than the comedy of Geoffrey Chaucer, but at the same time very different in their own way. So last time we talked about some of the important themes from the medieval period, such as courtly, well, actually we're getting to those today, but some of the important themes from the medieval period, such as the religious crisis in England, and that was very much emblematic of the entire medieval period. Christianity and Islam spread all through the Middle Ages, following the polytheistic cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. After those empires fell, the fall of the Roman Empire is usually considered the beginning of the medieval period. So you see, going from that polytheistic Roman Empire where they believed in multiple gods to the monotheistic religions of Christianity and Islam, those really spread. So that kind of religious tension that's apparent in Beowulf, that's a theme all throughout the medieval period in all kinds of different cultures. And also reflect back on the qualities of Beowulf as a hero. What made him a hero? We're going to compare and contrast him with Landval. So this might be a good point to pause the lecture and think through those qualities of Beowulf as a hero. It's a nice segue into what we're talking about today. Marie de France is quite the interesting writer. She opens her text by saying, "Marie is my name and I am from France," which is what her name means. But she's usually considered an author of British or English literature rather than French literature, even though she came from France. She came from France and always identified as being from France with that as part of her name. But she lived in England for most of her literary career, and she wrote in an Anglo-Norman dialect that following the Norman conquest in 1066 that we talked about last time, this dialect she wrote in had become the mother tongue of the English ruling class. So she was from France and she owned her identity as a French woman, but she very much wrote to and for the English. We talked about the importance of genre last time with epic poetry. Here we're looking at poetry again, but this is a different type of poetry. These are very short poems. Yet they still tell a narrative. They're longer than what we call lyric poems, which are the short type of poems you're probably more used to. But they're more like, if an epic poem is like a novel, then a lay is more like a short story. You can really read Marie de France like a short story, especially with the good translations we have here, even though, once again, this is originally in verse form, poetic form. And they're often very intense, her lays, kind of the way a short story has a lot of action packed into a short space. So that leads to intensity. And they deal with themes of love and loss. So those are the unique trademarks of the lay as a genre. In her work, she drew on a number of sources, particularly Celtic folklore, also the Anglo-French court, and the English landscape. We'll talk about these combinations more as we go along, but the one I'd like to kind of dwell on for just a moment here is the Anglo-French court. That term court, C-O-R-T, refers to a type of setting that was prominent throughout both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, so in pretty much all of the literature we'll read in this course. And that was essentially the group of people and the locations where they lived and interacted surrounding a king. So the probably most famous association is the court of King Arthur. And that's why we're starting with Marie de France, because her lays are set in King Arthur's court. So probably the most relatable court. But later on, we'll see other writers, such as the poem Song of Roland from France. That's a little bit different. That's in the court of King Charlemagne rather than the court of King Arthur. You're probably more familiar with the court of King Arthur. There was a recent movie. He's more well known in pop culture, etc. And so Anglo-French court. Anglo here because England isn't really England-Britain yet. It's still a group of ununited tribes. So the term Anglo refers to the English and then French, obviously. So both the English and French courts. She draws on both of those for inspiration here, even though she sets her stories in King Arthur's court because she was writing to that English audience. With these lays, these short, intense narratives about love and loss, she really set the stage for the flowering of the romance genre, which isn't a genre that's studied as much in classes on classic literature anymore. But at the end of the 12th century, so a little bit after her, in the late Middle Ages, many poems begin to kind of mimic her style, and that genre became known as the romance genre. So the term lay or lays to refer to her type of poetry is really a term associated more with Marie de France than other writers. And other writers who imitate her, we call that genre, more broadly speaking, the romance genre. Romance is a broad term that's used in quite a few different ways, but in the Middle Ages, that's how we use it. And so even though the romance genre isn't as much of a canonical genre that's studied a lot, because she set the stage for it, she was a very influential writer, and that's part of why we're studying her. We know very little about her biography. Most of it is speculation. Many scholars believe she may have been a nun, but she shared a close relationship with King Henry II, who was the King of England and also the Duke of Normandy at this time. And she presented the lays to him as a gift, which you'll see if you read the prologue. So scholars debate, and no one is certain for sure what type of relationship she had with King Henry VIII. We just know that she had some kind of relationship with him. She was part of his court, and she presented the lays, the collection of 12 lays, which Landval and Lustig come from this collection of 12 lays called the Lays of Marie de France. It's kind of like a collection of short stories. She presented that collection to him as a gift. So a lot of scholars think it was a familial relationship. Some even insinuate that it was a romantic relationship, which would be interesting since the king was married to the queen. But it would fit, right in with the Middle Ages courtly love thing. Um, and certainly with like the tension we see between Guinevere and Arthur and Landval in that poem. But none of that is really proven. It's mostly speculation. Interesting to think about, though. She strived to preserve the folk songs of Celtic, Welsh, and Briton cultures. So again, you had these different tribes or cultures kind of spread throughout England that were not united yet at this point. And they had a lot of oral traditions. And so again, her poems, just like Beowulf, are born out of a pre-existing oral tradition. She didn't make these stories up entirely herself. But in writing them, she put her own spin on them, and she wanted to preserve these traditions. Oral traditions would die out if not preserved. The Beowulf poem was recited for 500 years throughout Scandinavia and the British Isles, but if it hadn't been copied down by monks in the 11th century, it would have been lost to us forever. There was a vast oral tradition in ancient Greece that the Iliad and the Odyssey sprang from that, but if Homer hadn't written the Iliad and the Odyssey, that tradition would also be lost. So in writing these lays, she helps preserve some of the folk stories from these ancient Celtic, Welsh, and Briton cultures. And she helped bring these folk tales into the mainstream of European literature. This goes back to how influential she was. If not for Marie de France, this style of poetry would not have really entered into medieval European literature. So she made a name for herself well beyond Britain and France. Okay, so the reading questions for this lesson I'm going to spend a few minutes on, longer than normal, because here I ask you to consider two concepts that are central to understanding the Middle Ages. These concepts kind of appear in Beowulf, but since that's the first, well, not courtly love, but chivalry to a degree in terms of the bonds between, say, Hrothgar and his retainers in that community Beowulf enters into, which we talked about last time, you see kind of a precursor to chivalry there. Because that's one of the first texts of the Middle Ages, the idea is not fully fleshed out. Now that we're more so into the height of the Middle Ages with Marie de France, we have these two concepts that are so central to the Middle Ages at the forefront of her texts. So the first one is chivalry, which is a code of conduct for knights based on the belief that one grew closer to God by pledging his allegiance to a king or noble. So during the Middle Ages, the class structure, the society, the social classes were very hierarchical. But at the same time, one could more easily move up in class than they had before by becoming a knight. And by becoming a knight, someone pledged themselves to a noble or a king, someone higher up in society than them, and then followed a code of conduct, which is chivalry, that's the code of conduct, and by doing so brought honor and glory to themselves, subsequently the king, and subsequently God. So the hierarchy is kind of the knight, and then the king, and then above the king, God. And so this was a spiritual endeavor. Again, I mentioned at the start of the lesson how Christianity spread widely throughout the Middle Ages, throughout Europe at this time. So people became very focused on the afterlife and spirituality. And things like chivalry and courtly love emerged out of that. To the 21st century Christian today, it probably seems like an odd way to honor God or to grow closer to God. But at the time, people really believed in this. In the next lesson, when we talk about Song of Roland, we'll discuss how chivalry was really used as propaganda to recruit soldiers for the Crusades. But the average person, the average knight, really did believe this was a spiritual thing. Courtly love was very similar, but rather than pledging himself to a king or a noble, the knight would pledge himself to a woman, a beautiful, beloved, usually unattainable lady. Um, the unattainable aspect makes this a chaste romance. So they have a passionate romance, but unlike in Landval, which is kind of an exception, it's almost never culminated. Lostic is a more typical example of courtly love since the lovers never get together because the woman is married. So again, this probably seems odd to the 21st century Christian, but because it was a chaste romance, because the woman was unattainable, that made it a spiritual thing. You know, the man had to remain chaste and follow this code of conduct. Courtly love is a set of rules, just like with chivalry, and he had to follow that code to honor his lady, and it was hard to do since they could never actually be together. So by following the code and honoring it, he would bring once again glory to God and himself grow closer to God. Um, so these are, as I said, two central concepts of the Middle Ages, and they're both at the forefront of the Lays of Marie de France, from which we read Landval and Lostic. So definitely take some time here, pause the lecture, and think through how you see these two themes apparent in her works, if you haven't already done so. Here are some questions to guide us through the works themselves, and I'd like to take a few minutes to focus on the prologue. The prologue I find really interesting. You can read the Lays of Marie de France, and everyone knows Landval, that's her most famous one. In Lostic is a good example of the type of story we see in the collection. But people often don't take time to stop and read the prologue, and it's an important part that we also have here in our anthology. It's an integral part of it. So this is kind of her mission statement for this collection of what seem like short stories. And I think it's always important to think about the author's intent as part of the cultural context. So take a look at the prologue, delve into it deeper. What does she have to say there? On the passages for close reading part of the slide, I have the last lines of her prologue there, so definitely look at that under the lessons without audio and kind of revisit that prologue. But essentially what she's saying is that she wants to revive these Celtic folk tales and other folk tales from the British Isles, like I mentioned before. And then kind of compare to Landval and Lostic. Does she achieve this goal? I think especially Lostic is helpful. I should have put it on the next slide. I didn't. But if you look at the last 4 or 5 lines of Lostic, it's a set of lines that's set aside from the rest of the poem. She talks about how the nightingale was an important image in Celtic folklore, and she's carrying it on through this poem where the nightingale plays such a specific role. Next, after you delve through the prologue and you jump into Landval, think about Landval as a heroic figure. What type of hero is he? How is he similar to and different from Beowulf? Which one do you find more interesting or enjoyable to read? Landval is interesting. He represents kind of the exemplary knight of his day. He aspires to please his king. He gives gifts to his other fellow knights and treats them with hospitality, which is an integral part of it. And again, this is how we see this later work growing out of something like Beowulf, because last time we talked about Hrothgar and how he was generous to his retainers, the way Landval is generous to his fellow knights once he acquires the wealth from his lady. And so these things make him an exemplary knight, but he's not necessarily a strong figure. He's not the typical kind of protagonist we would think of when we think of a heroic knight. So it's interesting to read these pieces from the time period and look back and see how were knights really portrayed at the time, as opposed to how we think of them now in pop culture. Part of Landval's image, though, relates to the next question, which is the female characters. Marie de France, as a female writer, is clearly putting the females at the forefront of the text. And perhaps why Landval is not the strongest or most interesting character is that the females are just more interesting here. I think Marie de France wanted to make the females more interesting. So you have Landval's Lady and Queen Guinevere, who are both more powerful than their counterparts. Arthur kind of seems to lack power next to Guinevere. He kind of, does what she says and falls in line there. Similarly, Landval can't be saved without the help of his lady. So you have that, juxtaposition there, where Landval's lady is clearly a positive example of femininity, and the queen is perhaps a negative one, or they're the hero and the villain of the story. But how we, interpret that as positive, negative is a whole nother thing, which we'll get into with the learning questions. But Marie de France is certainly a writer who gives us an early example in Western literature of strong female characters, both protagonist and antagonist. And you might go into this expecting the male characters to be the strong ones and be surprised. It's kind of a reversal of gender roles for the time, which this was, 1,000 years ago, a very patriarchal culture. And then lastly, think about the Nightingale and Lostic, which I already mentioned with the first question. What does the Nightingale represent? Why does Marie de France make this non-human animal the center of the text rather than the human characters? It's a really violent, kind of moving scene when the husband kills the nightingale. And I think the nightingale, I would say it represents love. But that's a very kind of obvious reading. So I'd love for you in your own thinking to kind of go beyond that. But the nightingale, it begins as kind of a way for her to have an excuse for why she's out there on the balcony talking to her lover. And then when the husband kills it, it's symbolizing what he would like to do to their relationship. But this is very much a courtly love story, right? The husband is kind of like the villain, you could say. So the man and the woman, the two lovers here, their relationship is celebrated because it's a chaste relationship. They're never together. So it fulfills that courtly love code and that spirituality of that. And so with the villain here, the husband being opposed to their relationship, the nightingale that he brutally kills comes to represent their relationship. And so when their relationship can't go on, she passes the nightingale on to her lover, and then he preserves it. It's almost like an early example of taxidermy, which is really interesting as he preserves it. But I think in him preserving it, that's Marie de France saying that their love will go on forever. Or love, maybe not their love, but love is the only eternal thing. It outlasts everything else. So I would say that's the central message of the text, and the nightingale as a symbol helps her convey that message. So coming back to what we talked to last time about theme, that's the type of thing I'm looking for you to do when you interpret texts, both in your discussion board posts and your papers, is to give a argument a claim. For instance, Lostic is about love being the only thing that endures on this earth, and the nightingale is used to represent that when it's preserved. Something like that. Hopefully you see what I mean in terms of an example of literary analysis there. Here are the passages for close reading, like I've mentioned before. And these are the questions you can choose from for the discussion board if you would rather write on Marie de France rather than Geoffrey Chaucer. We talked about the representations of the female characters. Are these positive or negative? And then what do you use as your criteria for that? Are you thinking of like how we understand gender today, how it was understood at the time, or something that transcends both those time periods? I would say they're at least positive in that you have strong independent characters here. But at the same time, are they fully fleshed out, complex characters or not? Landval is also a text that deals with the overlap between fantasy and reality. Most medieval romances read like fantasy, but compared to the woodland setting of where Landval's lady lives, the Arthurian court where he is tried and convicted seems much more realistic. And so it's kind of like he escapes that reality into this fantasy world by going into the woods with his lady. But then at the end, she arrives in the Arthurian court to defend him. And there's kind of this clash between fantasy and reality. But then even after she saves him and they're free to go, they choose to leave that more real seeming court to go to the mystic Isle of Avalon, which is a fantastical place in British English folklore. So what is Marie de France saying here about fantasy versus reality? Beauty is also very important. Beauty is the trump card in Landval. What do you make of this? What do you think of this? Today we might say that that's very superficial. I mean, Landval is acquitted because his lady shows up and validates what he said as being true. But that testimony would have fallen flat if you didn't have all of these descriptions of both her and her ladies that precede her, that introduce her as being some of the most beautiful women in the world. And the queen is taken aback, when Landval rejects her. So beauty is at the forefront here. But what do we think of this? Perhaps how does question number 3 here relate to question number 1? Would be helpful. And finally, at the end, I mentioned how the poem ends with the Landval and his lovely lady here leaving for the mystic Isle of Avalon, which in English British folklore is where King Arthur eventually goes. It's this mystic place. It's kind of like heaven or paradise, you could say, in these medieval folk tales. So why do they leave and go there? He's acquitted. They're free. Why don't they just stay and live in England? It's a tough question to answer. Critics have grappled with it for years. Some say that Marie de France had a romantic relationship with King Henry II, of which the Queen was jealous. And that mirrors the relationship between Landval, his lady, and then Guinevere's anger in the poem. So it's kind of, stubbing her nose at the Queen by having them leave England rather than stay in England once they're free to go. But that's just one interpretation. I'd like to hear others. I'm very much a professor who encourages multiple interpretations. And that one's based kind of loosely on conjectured biographical facts. So what kind of commentary could Marie de France be making on England here by having her heroic characters leave it once they're free to go? Kind of one last tidbit to think about as you choose which of these questions to pursue in your discussion board posts. I hope you enjoyed Landval. Now we're going to transition to Geoffrey Chaucer, who's probably the most famous English writer of the Middle Ages outside of whoever the poet was that composed Beowulf, but has a very different style from the authors we've looked at so far. And he's very much a precursor leading up to the Renaissance, writing at the end of the Middle Ages. But at the start of this lecture, I talked about why we're discussing him now rather than later. So, kind of recall those issues of particular concern to English writers at the time. Religion, we got from Beowulf, that's carried on in Marie de France, but it's carried on specifically through chivalry and courtly love, which are also important. We've looked at a couple different genres, epic and romance. So think about the qualities of those genres, because now we're going to look at yet another genre, and I'd love to kind of compare and contrast the different genres we've seen so far. Here's some background on Chaucer. He was such a celebrated author, it's probably helpful to know a little bit more about him. People often call the Canterbury Tales the foundation of the poetic tradition in England. Definitely, one of the most famous English texts after Beowulf and Shakespeare. In the same way that Beowulf and Shakespeare influenced the language and how English as a language developed, so did Chaucer. So I mentioned that last time that Beowulf is written in Old English and Shakespeare is written in early modern English, and what we speak today is modern English. Those are 3 out of the 4 phases of the English language. And between Old English, Beowulf, and early modern English, Shakespeare, you have what we call Middle English. appropriately tiled, which is the language in which Chaucer wrote. So he's writing in a different language here than the Beowulf poet, even though they're both medieval authors. Um, and he's probably the most influential, or he is the most influential writer ever to write in Middle English. And so the English we have today has grown out of these previous languages. And so Chaucer's contributions, his impact, his influence on Middle English, if you were a linguistic scholar, you could see his influence is still present today in the English we speak, which is where this first bullet point comes from. And part of it is he emphasized the importance of vernacular language. Throughout the Middle Ages, we had what were called universal languages. In the West, Latin predominated, and the majority of literary texts were composed in Latin, even though they were composed in different countries, kind of a cosmopolitan type of thing. People could understand texts from different countries because they all spoke Latin. And in the East, the same thing was true with Arabic. But you saw toward the end of the Middle Ages, beginning especially with people like Chaucer, the rise of vernacular language. And that term vernacular in this context is considered the opposite of a universal, meaning that it was local, regional, specific. So rather than writing in Latin, he wrote in Middle English. But he grew to be highly acclaimed and considered of great importance by his contemporaries throughout Europe. So he helped introduce vernacular Middle English into the mainstream as kind of a challenge to Latin. And this again goes back to that first point, emphasizing the significance of his contributions here to the English language and language in general. So there were other popular British writers at the time. Thomas Malory, who wrote La Morte d'Arthur, which is probably the most famous recounting of the Arthurian legends. The anonymous poet who wrote Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So there were other English writers at this time. Chaucer wasn't writing in isolation. But rather than being compared to these other English writers, he was more often compared to people like Dante, who were considered great. Dante from Italy, who we'll study in a few lessons, was considered, one of the greatest or the greatest writer of the Middle Ages. And so joining that company with these European rather than English writers, since England was still a fledgling young country at this time, is what I mean. He was really elevated to a high status, and that's why his contributions, mentioned in the first 2 points, could really have an impact. Such an impact that Queen Elizabeth's tutor called Chaucer our English Homer. So that's some background on why he was so important. Now a little bit about his life. Well, one thing that's really interesting is going back to the previous part of this lecture, we talked about the social fluidity, of medieval England, where people could move up in social class more so than they could in the past, particularly by becoming a knight, but not always by becoming a knight. And in Chaucer's case, he did it without becoming a knight, and he's a great example of it. He started out as he did not come from a highborn family, and he started out as kind of a mundane record keeper, doing all this record keeping during the day and writing his great poems at night. But he eventually became a page for a royal family, so he really worked his way up in society. There's also often a political bent to his writing. But going back to the Dante comparison, Dante was excommunicated for his attacks against the Catholic Church and his critique of the Pope. Chaucer, being a writer who uses humor and comedy, he was much more subtle and clever. So he was able to make political critiques, but not everyone picked up on them. So he was never really punished for them, even though there is that political element to his writing. He did serve as both a soldier and a diplomat, which allowed him to travel throughout France and Spain and Italy and interact with people like Dante. And this, influenced his writing and made it even more significant, even more influential. The last point here is related to genre. So we've looked at the epic with Beowulf. We've looked at the romance in the lay with Marie de France. With Chaucer, we're going to see our first real example of comedy. There may be comedic elements in the other writers, but we see a lot of comedy here. That's kind of the main thing, but the Canterbury Tales aren't just a comedy. They're also a frame narrative. A frame narrative is where you have a story with a beginning and an end, but in between that beginning and end, you have a bunch of other stories. So Chaucer's writing poetry again. Fiction, the novel, hasn't really been invented yet, so this is again written in verse. But the verse here, rather than being saying an epic or a lay, is a frame narrative. So, like Marie de France, it reads like a collection of short stories. But the short stories are bookmarked by a beginning and an end. That's why you have a long prologue. And so that's the idea of a frame, right? Like a picture frame surrounding a picture. So there's a main story, the pilgrimage here, and then there's these interrelated stories inside it. So the last question on the learning questions will ask you about genre. And if you choose to answer that, I'd like you to say which genre you enjoy the most. You can consider epic, romance, and comedy, but you could also consider the experience of reading a frame narrative here and what that was like. One important aspect of a frame narrative is that you can have kind of an overarching theme, a main message for the text that is echoed throughout all the stories. So the stories may seem different. The wife of Bath's tale may seem different from the knight's tale, or the miller's tale, or the pardoner's tale, or the nun's priest's tale, but there might be something common, something similar in all of them that echoes that main theme. That's not always true, and it's certainly less apparent in Chaucer, although it is there, than other frame narratives. Probably the most famous frame narrative of all time is the 1001 Nights, which we'll look at a couple lessons later. And that one very clearly has a theme that's echoed all the way through. It's not just the most famous example of a frame narrative, but the 1001 Nights utilizes the frame concept better than any other frame narrative. But Chaucer still does a good job of it himself, so think about that. And that takes us to the reading questions. And I ask, what do you think is the theme or central idea from the prologue? So rather than just say the wife of Bath's tale, think about the general prologue to the whole thing. What idea is Chaucer trying to convey there? Now, more minutely, take a look at the wife of Bath's prologue and tale. What theme is there? Or themes, plural. And then do you see any parallels? Is the theme of the whole work being echoed in the wife of Bath's tale? The wife of Bath's tale is the most famous tale from the Canterbury Tales, so that's why I selected it for a reading. The textbook also contains the Pardoner's Tale, but I didn't want to have you have to read too much. So we only have one story to look at for considering the frame. Whereas when we read 1001 Nights in a few weeks, the stories are much shorter. We'll look at a bunch of them, and we'll see how that frame thing plays out. But you can still make the comparison here with the wife of Bath. So think about it. What from the prologue is echoed specifically in the wife of Bath, and how does the connection between the two help you understand what a frame narrative is? All right, let's go through the text. So before looking specifically at the wife of Bath, let's take a look at all of the pilgrims, since we get to see them in the general prologue. Kind of like Marie de France had that prologue to her collection of lays, the Canterbury Tales is also like a collection of short stories in verse form. We have a prologue here, although here it's much longer because it's a frame narrative. Marie de France's collection is like a unrelated collection. It's a collection, but not a collection with a frame. The prologue is much longer here because it needs to frame this collection of stories that follows. What's interesting is in the prologue, you get to meet all of the pilgrims. So even though we're only reading the wife of Bath's tale, you still get introduced to everyone. And the thing that has always stood out to me about the Canterbury Tales that I find interesting is that these are widely different people, very different personalities. Chaucer's using them to make all different kinds of points. But they're also, I mean, you might expect them to have different personalities, right? That keeps it funny and interesting. But they're also from varying social classes and occupations. You have people at the top of society and the bottom of society. So why that? Why didn't he make them all nobles? Wouldn't that seem more likely in this time? What might Chaucer be saying about social class here? Is it kind of a cosmopolitan thing? Is this journey to Canterbury, this pilgrimage, is it cosmopolitan? Cosmopolitanism often involves travel. It doesn't have to, if we think about it in a broad sense, but certainly one way to embody cosmopolitanism is to visit different places. So these people from all these different parts of society are taking this journey together. Kind of connecting back to the reading questions, do we see any connections between the pilgrims themselves? Do people from very different social classes and occupations make connections with each other? If so, then does that mean that this text is cosmopolitan? Very important question to think about in understanding Chaucer's goal. To keep coming back to the previous question, which will appear in a little bit different form on the learning questions as well. So keep that in your mind. These other three questions deal with the wife of Bath, since she's the one whose story and prologue we really get to read here of the different pilgrims. And she embodies a lot of stereotypes. She seems, at least at first, like kind of a cliche. She's probably one of the most famous women in all of English literature, one of the most famous female characters. The wife of Bath is certainly the most famous of the tales from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So why is that? What do we learn about her? Initially, she seems to embody a lot of stereotypes, and it seems like some negative ones. This was a very patriarchal culture, so women were usually seen in two ways, either as virtuous and innocent and only good, or as a harlot, as sinful. There wasn't a lot of middle ground for women to embody a variety of roles, which is part of what makes it patriarchal. And so the wife of Bath initially embodies that kind of negative stereotype when she talks about her 5 husbands, in that she slept with these different men, and kind of she really embraces her sexuality. At the time, that wouldn't be something that would be readily accepted by most people. So what do we think of that? But that's just the beginning. The stereotypes are just the beginning. There's much more to the wife of Bath than that. We get to go beyond the stereotypes. And in celebrating her sexuality, she might also be kind of embracing a more independent side, being a more independent female. That might not be something Chaucer wants us to take as a negative. Again, remember, he is very subtle. So it's not like she's only a stereotype. She embodies some stereotypes, but then as we get to know her more and we read more about her and we learn more about her, we understand, we get into her psychology, we get to know her personality. She has a complex inner life. And I ask, in literature, what are the qualities of a great character? We may have characters we like. One of my all-time favorite characters is Captain America. I love Captain America, but my wife, who's also a professor of literature, does not like Captain America. Well, she doesn't dislike Captain America, but she says he's not a great character. She says Iron Man or Thor is a better character because they're more complex. They go through change, whereas Captain America is kind of one thing, kind of one note. And so if you agree with my wife's standard, which I think is a good standard, even though I love Captain America, I think that's a good barometer for evaluating what makes a great character. Are they more than one note? Because the reason why is human beings are more than one note. A real person is complex and flawed and embodies all different kinds of things. And so when you have a literary character who is complex and flawed and plays out more than just one role, that character is much more like a real person, which I would argue makes them a better character, although you're welcome to disagree with that. In The Wife of Bath, by first embodying the stereotypes, but then getting to know her more, learning more about her, she is definitely a multifaceted, complex, flawed character. And that's specifically powerful because, like I said, women at this time weren't able to occupy a lot of roles. They were either completely virtuous and good, or any indiscretion made them evil. There was no middle ground. So the wife of Bath occupies all kinds of middle ground. The problem with not allowing women to occupy a middle ground in literary representation is that it doesn't make them like real people. It treats them as objects or subhuman. The wife of Bath, by being this multifaceted, complex, flawed character, is more like a real person. That's something female characters didn't often have at the time. And so this makes her, in my opinion, a great positive representation of femininity. And part of her complexity is that she's kind of giving a performance when she talks about her sexuality and fits those negative stereotypes. She's acting a bit. That's not necessarily what she actually thinks. She's so complex that we can't take everything she says at face value. Some of it we can, but not all of it. And so we have to kind of think, what things are she saying where she's kind of making that up or kind of playing there to kind of tease some of the other characters? And what does she really mean? What are the things that she really believes? So if you read the text carefully and slowly, you'll start to be able to distinguish that. And you'll see that most of the negative things, most of the stereotypical things she says, are the ones that are an act. And the valuable things she says, the things she says that we like, those are the ones that we should believe. So that helps us understand better how Chaucer's using this complex, flawed character to show the full gamut of humanity in this female character. And once we do that, once we kind of separate out what we have to be skeptical about and what we can believe from the things she says, we can understand ultimately what she truly values. And we learn that, I believe it's her 5th husband. I lose track sometimes. I think she has 5 total. Her current husband, the other 4 are gone. She really, for the first time, despite having these sexual relationships with the other ones, has an intimate, loving bond, true love, you could say, with her 5th and final husband here. And that seems to be what she values most. So ultimately, you have this very positive message coming through once you kind of peel away the other layers. And that helps us see her as a real person, which I mentioned is what makes it a positive representation of femininity. To juxtapose with Landval, you have 2 very strong, independent female characters there. And the wife of Bath is also a strong, independent female character. But the female characters in Landval are very one note. Landval's lady is beautiful and does everything she's supposed to, virtuous and good. And Queen Guinevere is the opposite. She's the villain. So those 2 extremes that I said were the only roles women were allowed to embody, those are embodied by Landval's lady and Queen Guinevere in Landval. With the wife of Bath, you have something in the middle. She embodies both. That makes her more of a real person rather than a stereotype. She moves beyond the stereotype here. So, hopefully that's helpful to understanding kind of what makes for a great character in literature, how authors create those characters, and the significance of gender roles at this time, the Middle Ages. All right, so some questions for you to think about for the discussion board. The first one is very similar to the first one for Beowulf. Just like with Beowulf, where we had some lines in Old English with a very loyal Old English translation at the start of the poem, before reading the whole thing in a more modern English, easy to read translation. Similarly with the Canterbury Tales, we have the first 18 lines entirely in Middle English. And Old English has some similarities to modern English. Some words are exactly the same in Old English and modern English, but Middle English is even more similar to modern English. So these first 18 lines before the translation, that earlier set of lines, is not even translated. So if you want to answer this question, I think it'd be a great endeavor. Just try reading through those lines in your textbook and see what jumps out. What similarities do you see to the Old English in Beowulf? What similarities do you see to the English we speak today? This second question here comes back to the reading questions and the first question from the previous slide, and to me is one of the most important questions you can answer for this text. The reading questions often get at the most important things, so I try to bring them back by stating them in a little bit different, kind of more complex, pushing you a little bit further away on the learning questions, for the discussion board. So, what is the overall theme, and do we see it in the other characters echoed throughout, especially the wife of Bath? Throughout what's inside the frame, do we see the larger message there? Again, you'll have to determine what that is, and then make the argument. It could certainly be a message about love. It could certainly be a cosmopolitan message. Like I said earlier, I don't want to give you too much there because I want to see what you can come up with. Travel is a really important theme. The characters in the Canterbury Tales are on a pilgrimage, but it's echoed throughout. The wife of Bath is a weaver, which was a newer occupation for women at the time, which gives her some independence and some autonomy. At this time, women were for the first time starting to have jobs on their own, and they were usually, I guess you could say, blue collar type jobs, but they allowed them to travel some for their work, and so that was kind of a freeing, independent, autonomous thing. And so travel in both the prologue and in the frame and in the Wife of Bath's tale is an important theme. So this question could clearly connect to the previous one, and it also relates to, as I said, cosmopolitanism. So a couple interesting things for you to think about there. And finally, genres. I think I did a good job of laying them all out earlier, not to toot my own horn, but hopefully I laid them out clearly for you earlier with the epic, the romance, the comedy, and the frame narrative. Which one do you like the most and why? Definitely worth exploring. I hope you enjoyed Marie de France and Chaucer. I look forward to discussing more literature with you next time.